Hi everyone.
Hello.
Welcome to Inside the Rookery, Season 1, Episode 12. Today we're welcoming Lawrence Schick, writer and games designer, previously lead Loremaster on one of my favourite games and sometime obsession, Elder Scrolls Online, and currently lead narrative designer on Baldur's Gate 3. I'm also joined by fellow Rooks, Andy Law and Mark Gibbons. As concept artist or cartographer, designer or producer, they're both also experienced in the joys and challenges of creating shared worlds. So welcome to all of you. As always, we have pre-submitted questions by patrons and members of the Discord community. Thank you, as always, for your continued support. We couldn't make these deep dives and behind-the-scenes discussions without you, with some of our industry's luminaries. And now, as always, I'll be looking for comments and questions from the chat, so please do jump in and I will try to get to as many as possible and get involved. And if you're watching on YouTube afterwards, please remember to like and subscribe and perhaps even join us on Discord to contribute to future topics, questions and more. So, introduction over. I'm going to pass over to Lawrence to talk to us about what we mean by shared worlds and introduce himself. Lawrence,
All right.
over to you.
And talk I shall. I'm going to blather on for several minutes here, but don't let that stop you if you have comments. Yeah. So I've been working in role-playing games a long time. I started back in white box D&D and worked for TSR in the late 70s, and then have been working in and around role-playing games for over 40 years, and I still am. And so I have lots of thoughts. I have thoughts about role-playing games, some of which we're gonna share tonight, and we're gonna be talking about shared worlds because this is a subject that is near and dear to my creative heart. Nowadays, nearly everyone who works in fantasy RPGs does so in shared worlds, settings that are designed and built by multiple creators, both simultaneously, built all together at once, and then they accrete new lore and background material over time. And increasingly, it's not just the designers who contribute to these collective creations; it's players as well. So where did this idea come from? And how do you design a world that welcomes the contributions of many diverse hands, some of whom have never met and don't even know one another? So it's a fascinating problem to solve. So where did this idea come from? How far back does it go? You think of when you think of a fantasy world, you think of like Middle Earth. That fantasy world has one big lore source, and that's the author of J.R.R. Tolkien. But really, shared worlds is a concept that goes back at least as far as the individual owner of a campaign or a background for their stories, and probably farther. We can go back. We don't have to go back any farther than oral traditions like the Robin Hood tales, or shared literary traditions like the Arthurian tales of Europe in the 12th to 15th centuries. In modern times, where this really starts with is with Sherlock Holmes fandom in the very early 20th century, well before the word fandom was even invented. They started to look at the stories as if they had happened in an actual world and figure out a way to weave them together. And people started making contributions to that background. The most relevant idea example of that shared world idea that came next was really, I think, H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu Mythos, because he came up with the original stories of the great old ones and the elder gods. And then other people said, I want to write about that stuff too. And he encouraged them. He brought them in. He embraced his fellow writers and said, sure, go ahead. And they said, well, do you want to vet our ideas? And he was like, nah, just go for it. This is cosmic horror. And furthermore, and this is a key point, it's cosmic horror that's always from the viewpoint of the or often unreliable viewpoint of a protagonist. And so if different stories conflict, who cares? Of course they conflict. People see things from different attitudes. So this actually was, with the rest of the Weird Tales group, this was one of the immediate influences on Dungeons and Dragons and early role-playing games like that. The idea that you could share a story space, not just among players with their game master, but even among multiple game masters. You could have a world that many people could be running games in. That really took off with early Dungeons and Dragons, and it made its way back into fiction with series like Robert Asprin's Thieves' World and George R.R. Martin's Wild Cards. Initially, though, a lot of these worlds were like Tolkien's Middle-earth. They had like a single truth that came from some lore source. Gary Gygax for World of Greyhawk, Greg Stafford for Glorantha with RuneQuest, and so forth. It wasn't until it was only gradually that the idea that multiple creators working together in a world was as legitimate as having a single lore daddy. That was just as good, if not better. You start to see that with. Sorry, go on.
On Robert Jordan, that was one of my first experiences of fandom. It was in the late 90s, and we used to gather first on like Usenet groups and then on a forum later and talk about the Wheel of Time and talk about all the lore. And from there, that was before they released the lore books. But interestingly, we had a cousin of Robert Jordan was on that forum, and he used to like relay stuff backwards and forwards about our favorite fan theories. And Robert would occasionally come on and like pass a judgment on how close or far away we were. And it was a really interesting experience that you don't usually get with a novelist about their lore and the world. And that, lore of that world that he created was really rich and really, interesting for people to jump into. And I remember obsessively working out who we would cast as what roles for each of the main characters in that book. And of course, they're now on Amazon with obviously like 26 years have passed. Nobody that we imagined. It's interesting to know that Sherlock Holmes was one of the first fandoms. That's fascinating.
Yes, it must have been quite a lot of fun to talk directly with, or even at one step removed with Robert Jordan, because novelists are often so very proprietary of their fictional space, unlike game designers who tend to be more open because we have to be, right? We are inviting people into our world not just to experience it the way we wrote it. Damn it, this is the way I wrote it. This is the way it is. We experience people. We invite people to come in and actually mess with our worlds. They get to play with our worlds and add their own ideas. And so we have to invent worlds that are actually welcoming to other people's ideas, whether they're other designers or whether they're other players. And you started to see this in tabletop role-playing worlds as they began to have a lot of publications that were not done by the original developer or the original lore owner of the world. And it really took off when TSR started publishing The Forgotten Realms, which was Ed Greenwood's world originally. It predated fantasy role-playing games, just like Greg Stafford's Glorantha did. And so he had a whole lot of information. And so he was, he was the single source for information on Forgotten Realms. But once TSR and other people started setting lots of scenarios and lots of world background in it that were written by lots of other people, very rapidly, the Forgotten Realms grew to be something different. than it was under just Ed Greenwood's sovereignty.
So I guess you've covered a little bit there, Alexandre's question, which is what are the advantages of shared world design over solo? But she's also asked, what are the advantages of solo world design over shared?
Well, the advantage of solo world design is consistency and coherence. You don't have people coming in with ideas that don't fit at least in your mind, right? So when you're coming up with a individual game, like the Outer Wilds, say, that video game, which is done by a small team, and so they got to decide everything about the background of that world and make it all interrelate and be entirely consistent. And they don't have to worry about particularly what people are going to bring into it, because it's a single player game, and all of their options are built into the game. And so everything in that game hangs together, and all of the decisions just simply add more richness to an existing set of ideas. That is a luxury that you can't have when you're doing, an MMO or a big multiplayer game, or a game that is set in an IP like the Forgotten Realms, like Baldur's Gate 3 is. You get an IP like that, like Forgotten Realms, which has got, not just role-playing tabletop scenario publications, but novels and comic books and all kinds of different media, and so much of it that it is literally impossible to encompass it from a single standpoint. And so if you're working, you get to that point where so many people have added so many ideas to it, many of them contradictory, that when you are building a new game in that area, you have to figure out how you're going to pick your way through all of the stuff that's gone before, and pick stuff that is relevant to the game that you are making.
We've talked about that a bit before, Lawrence, especially Andy's experience on Wifrip 4 when he was bringing together 3 different editions plus however many editions there are of the battle game. Is it like, I don't know, I'm totally behind. I'm probably
8.
only stuck on 8. Yeah, 8, am I right? And trying to find ways to make everything true whilst at the same time pick one thing that was true. And that was an interesting experience that often involved, retconning things as in character, or, with chaos, it might be that there were 2 different things that happened. And what about you, Mark, in terms of your experience at Blizzard? Does what Lawrence is saying chime with you?
Yeah, I was going to actually say even more so when I was at Riot. I was brought into the world building team, which is a new team there, as with the studio wanting to expand beyond what was a League of Legends, which is the big MOBA battle arena where pretty much anything went, and trying to place this. There must have been a stable of about 120 champions at the time, putting them all together into one world and having them hang together in any kind of way that made some sort of internal logic was quite a challenge, particularly when you've got new champions coming up that have rocket launchers and miniguns. You think, well, this is a fantasy setting, and how can we sort of agree at a level of technology that's consistent throughout these worlds? And magic is always the great leveler, But how do we balance that with how do these characters work alongside each other outside of the arena where they're fighting? What happens if these characters meet each other in the street? Is there a street, in fact, where these characters could meet and not have it be wildly anachronistic? So yeah, that's always you try and wrestle some sort of internal logic into this world that is a fantasy world, but still there's a need, I think, to have it hang together in some sort of way that it makes sense.
And if people want to see some of your influences, they can watch Arcane, can't they? There's lots of touches from you in that series. Nice plug. Available on Netflix now, yes.
Well done.
But that is
Really good series.
It's the technology and the magic, the hex tech, which is the thing that kind of grew out of that. Making how does this stuff make sense? In a wider world, and how can we tell stories that actually? So I think Arcane is a great example of what writers have done with some fairly sort of fast and loose ideas that were thrown together for the sake of making a game work. And now, this is just a world we want to tell rich stories in. So it's the subtlety that the writers have invested. It blew my mind when I watched it. So it's very impressive.
And so I'm going to go into Seagoat's question, but before we do, Oil Painting 71, with particular reference to Wifrup, it said, how do we justify imposter halflings, for instance? A particularly controversial point in the community. So Seagoat asks, are there any rules of thumb when working on collaborative design that you've learned over the years? Sorry about there's siren after siren to me.
So there are a couple of different ways that you approach working in a big sprawling world with lots of sources of background. One of them is that you've got all these facts, and some of the facts are contradictory, and you have to decide which ones you're going to embrace and which ones you're going to kind of ignore. But to my mind, there's an overarching thing to keep in mind that actually helps you with this, helps you with everything, which is not only do you have all the facts of the background for the game that you're building, but you in your particular game have got a certain tone and ambiance that you are trying to convey in your game, and so you can use the means of tone to decide what things are actually relevant to your game and what things are not. What things fit the tone? You don't want stuff that's going to be slapstick if you are trying to keep serious, for example. You don't want references to pop culture things if that's going to break your immersion, right? Unless you've got but if you're doing a Shrek game, then that's part of the tone, is references to stuff that's actually outside your IP. So setting your tone and then sticking to it, I think, is really important in maintaining your coherence in the face of a huge quantity of factual background, as it were.
And when you've set that tone, how do you prevent yourself from getting really annoyed when someone does the wrong thing in a shared world? Or put it another way, rein in your possessiveness. I can tell you that Andy Law writes incredibly long and detailed emails in those situations, and Mark Gibbons just throws a hissy fit. But how do you deal with it, Lawrence?
Well, I'm often, when people come to me and say, can I do this, right? Here's what I want to do. I've got a really good idea. I want to do this idea. And it doesn't fit, right? I almost never say, no, we're not going to do that. Get out of here. Mm-hmm. Instead, it's best to kind of turn it around and say, all right, let's look at this idea and let's see how this idea would be done within the lore of this particular background. Not do we do it, but how do we do it? How does this fit? What parts of this would resonate with the other stuff that we're doing? And then let's emphasize that. And then the other bits just kind of fall away, and you don't have to worry about it. So, and then you get to maintain somebody's really cool idea, but in a way that's appropriate to everybody else's cool ideas that are in the project. So you want to keep everybody engaged. And the same is true for the players. If you keep your tone and your background solid and consistent, then the players know what is right and what is wrong when they get into your game, and they know by the look and the feel, kind of what the expectations of the background are, and so when they go along with that, then it meets their expectations, and that makes them feel like they have understood the world that they're in, and it makes them feel good about their choices. Clarity of that.
Yeah, I find occasional moments where somebody will have an idea for something that is on the surface whimsical or always say slapstick, something like that. And I think as long as if the general feeling is it's actually really good, but is it messing with the tone too much? If you can find a counterpoint to it, yes, you can indulge in the silly and the funny, but then there's a swing to something dark before it or after it, to sort of so you've got that roller coaster of tension going through. It gets a little bit more forgiving if you've got counterpoint to it, to sort of throw some of that stuff into the mix as well.
I'm going to loosely just agree with Lawrence's point. Yes, and is generally a far better route than no, but or some equivalent. It's in terms of working within an established team, that's a very important part of ensuring that everybody stays happy. Because if you are constantly saying no to people, they feel like their creative input is not being appreciated. And that is just not a good way to build or work with a team. If you're dealing with lots of freelancers and then it's pitches coming in, that's a slightly different position to be in, because you can say this doesn't match for this reason or that reason. Or if you're a blunter person, you might just say nope and move on, which is quite different to working with an established team of 5, 10, 20 writers and artists or whatever. But I broadly and wholeheartedly support that general perspective, which is you don't want to be the person who is saying no. You want to be the person that's saying, how can we best make this work and build something truly awesome? Because you tend to find that the best creative outcomes come when everybody's working together and you've got lots of minds working around similar ideas. If you have just one mind working on one idea, you often find that the end results, whilst they might be amazing, might not be as amazing as it could have been if you've got some of those other minds that may not immediately have first appeared to fit well, but with a little bit of discussion and massaging of the ideas, suddenly you've got something beautiful coming out of what was originally something you weren't so sure about.
I think we just answered Alexandre's question.
We have. So maybe I'll go into Martin's, which is a bit more specific, and that is, from your own experience, have you ever encountered a point where compromise breaks or has broken the core concept of a nation, faction, people, or any design choice, I guess?
Usually this kind of, usually something that breaks your core concepts, often it comes top down, which makes it harder to deal with. So, it's the creative director's idea or marketing's idea or publishing's idea. And then, if it's a creative director, that comes in the form of that's clear direction. We got to figure out how this is going to fit in here without breaking it. But if you're dealing with drive-bys like from marketing or publishing, then it's more a matter of deflecting it by what you do is you look at the idea that is wildly inappropriate and you say, all right, why did they suggest this? What do they want? And then you try to figure out how to give them what they want that works within the realm of what you're presenting, of the world that you're building. Because once again, these folks are going to sell your game. You don't want to blunt their ideas, and they think that they've got an idea that's going to help sell your game, and maybe they're right. So I mean, they have their expertise, and so it's best to try to figure out what they're looking for, and you can just ask them often. That's a good idea because why? What's that going to get us? And then you can figure out how to meet their needs without bending your game out of its core concepts. So as usual, it's about not just saying no, but about looking at what people's ideas really are and how you can actually work them in.
I'll add a little bit to that as well and take it from a slightly different angle. Something that happens a lot in role-playing games is working on a license, where you're working on somebody else's IP. For example, I used to run Warhammer, so I was running on Games Workshop's IP. And you might find your compromise that comes down from above, it has come from above order, is the person who owns the IP. And it may contradict something that they had previously said. It may contradict something that you've been working on for some time. And that's just part and parcel of working on somebody else's IP. There is no point in getting annoyed or upset or bothered by that. You simply have to sit down and say, what is it do they want? How do we incorporate that best with what we have? If we can't, what do we do to move onwards? Has it ever, however, broken a core concept of a nation, faction, or people? I would never say that in my experience it's gone that far, but I do know that of several games where that has happened when they're working on someone else's IP, and games have had to be ditched and restarted from the ground up because the IP holder decided they wanted a different angle. And that's just part of the trouble with working on an IP that someone else owns.
Yeah, quite so. Sometimes you feel that you understand well what the IP has been all about, but the IP owner wants to take it in a different direction for some sort of commercial reason, and then all you can do is either go along or go away. So that's you just have to look at take all those situations as they come.
Yeah, and again, I tend to find it's generally best to work from a yes and perspective, because it just generally always makes you feel better as well. So you don't need to feel frustrated with the situation. You go, right, so this is what we have. How can we best work with this?
So here's a question from Seagoat. What is your preference, having initial concept art pieces that are used to influence the world design, or having the world design informing the art for the piece?
Why not both?
That's what I was going to say.
The best thing to do is to sit down with your visual folks and your conceptual folks and your story folks, and get everybody on the same page. Brainstorm the shit out of it until you get it. Everybody has got a clear idea of where you're going with the project, and that their ideas are all incorporated. Because they're going to have good ideas that you didn't have, because that's why they're doing their thing, right? That's why you have concept artists, because you're not a concept artist. So the best thing to do is to try to get everybody into the mix as soon and as often as possible.
I broadly agree with that completely. I've been on projects where the communication from above was not necessarily clear. So you might find that the writers were told they were doing one thing. The cartographer, myself in this particular instance, was told to do a completely different thing. But I generally find that as long as I'm part of a project and I know what's going on, I try to keep the communication lines open, even when the message from up high is off you go and do your own thing. Because you'll often find that the conflicting messaging can cause mighty problems at a later date. As a single example, when I was working on Titan's Grave, Will Wheaton was running the primary lore side of that. And he gave me absolute carte blanche to do whatever I wanted on the map side, while simultaneously he'd said largely the same thing to the writing team regarding the areas that they were describing. That obviously wasn't going to work at all and couldn't work. But fortunately, I knew the person who was writing it, got in contact and said, this is what is going down just now. How do we best organize this? And he just got back to me and said, oh, well, you're right. In fact, he in this case is Chris Pramus, who was on just a few weeks ago. And Chris was very much like, yeah, off you go, Andy, you go map it, and then we'll figure out how it works from that point onwards. And that was mostly due down to enthusiasm for the project at that point. The people were all so excited to be involved that they often forgot to just talk. And that's something that as creatives, you've got to be careful of as well, because there is a business side of all of these things that needs to be kept very carefully in line. We need to make sure that everybody is talking and clearly, so that there isn't issues that arise later, because when it comes to creativity, people can get quite involved and it becomes personal because it's something that they've built and it's something that you might love. And then to have somebody turn around and say, sorry, we can't use that, can actually be almost like a dagger to the heart. So ensuring that everybody's working from the same page and ensuring that we can work from the perspective where both art and writing is working hand in hand is, I feel, a far better place to begin.
Yeah. I would say, I mean, certainly, it's whether you're a writer, an artist, a designer. This is merely the tools of your trade, and it's the tools of your creative trade. However you get that stuff out, it's all equally valid and equally relevant. Whether you're drawing a picture, writing words, it's the communication of ideas. And I think establishing that there's a level playing field for contribution. Everybody, you know, whatever your idea, whether it's scribbled on the back of a wet beer mat or whether you've written a 10,000 word treatise on something, it's all grist to the creative mill, I think. And I think just establishing a sort of welcome environment in which ideas are encouraged is a great starting point.
And we've got one here from Smiling Tom. How did you decide the level of precision a setting should have? Of late, I'm finding many settings that give a lot of cues and brushstrokes, but don't go into detail, leaving to GMs to finish the picture.
So this is, there are different requirements here depending upon whether you're talking about a tabletop game or a video game. With a tabletop game, you have the ability to go into greater or lesser detail relatively inexpensively, because it's just how many words you're going to spill on a certain thing, right? In a video game, the detail has to be backed up by level after level of visual and audio assets, and geography and animation and stuff. And so where you're going to expend your efforts to add your precision and detail becomes a really critical question. And the answer is almost always that you expend your efforts in detail on the stuff that is directly relevant to the story that you're involving the player in. And then everything gets fuzzier as you go out from that. And that's okay, because the players are going to experience the stuff that you have put the most effort into. And the fuzziness is really, that's just a wealth of, that's just the feel of the background that gives the context to the precise stuff that's right in front of your face. Also, by leaving the background somewhat open, you are inviting players to make up their own minds about what's out there and how it's relevant to what they're doing, so that they can make their own choices. And it's one of the ways of inviting a player into your world, is to give them space. Give them space to make up their own minds about who they are, where they came from, what they're doing here, and what significance their choices have. Put a lot of detail into the immediate context for the players so they can figure out how they fit into it, but then let them decide and give them some space to waffle around. So that's enough on that for me.
A follow-up question, I suppose, is how important do you think it is to include the players in shaping the world? Again, it's an interesting question, because the answer will differ depending on the medium that you're using.
Yes, but even in video games, there's different answers to this question. On the one hand, if you've got a really clearly defined commercial IP that is appearing in multiple media and in different games, that is going to be shaping that world is going to be very closely held by the people who are making the commercial decisions regarding it. But there's ways that you can still, even with a game like that, even with a realms like that, there's ways of letting people in. And let me give an example from something I recently worked on, which was the Elder Scrolls. Starting with the Elder Scrolls started out, as pretty much a generic D&D world. But starting with Morrowind, it got weird. And it not only got weird, but they came up with an idea that was really interesting and inclusive. And it really harks back once again to Lovecraft and his Cthulhu Mythos and Lovecraft admitting in everybody else's ideas. The way lore is presented in Elder Scrolls about their world of Tamriel is that it is always presented not from this top-down, here's our history standpoint, but from the standpoint of individual characters who live in the world. So lore is always presented from the point of view of in the game, not from outside the game. There is no biblical authority handing down the tablets of truth. Truth is always subjective, in Tamriel, and it's always inheres in what the individual agenda and point of view is of the character who wrote that lore book, or who gave you that quest, or who lived thousands of years before and was even their opinions and stuff is all it's all from the individual standpoint. So they're all equally legitimate, and that invites the player to do the same thing, to come in and say, oh, here's how I see it, here's how my character sees it. I can write lore books that are just as legitimate and as relevant as these lore books that are in the game, because they're all from the standpoint of inside the world rather than outside of it. So that's a very inclusive way. I think it's kind of a brilliant approach that wouldn't apply to every IP, but has become a core of the admission of players into the creative process in Elder Scrolls and Tamriel. And it's not just the MMO, but also in the single player games. It also brings up that now in the last couple of decades with the internet, we have the tools to bring players in early, in the middle, and late, and that were not available before when it was just publishing and fire and forget, so it's really important to find, if not the Tamriel direction, some direction that does give players their own way to make contributions.
Yeah, it's sort of a follow-up question, but I think you've maybe just answered it. So is fan material which builds on existing material something which should therefore be cherished by game creators? We have had people on the stream who said, I don't read anything because I never want to read other people's material and find it sneaking its way into my own. So that's like one very polarized view on one side. Is
right,
there
and
space for something else?
The phrase "my own," kind of stands out there, right? That's not very inviting and inclusive.
Yeah.
So that's a different approach to a shared world. Really, that's an owned world. Sorry, I stepped on your comment.
No, I think you're right. Though it is, because it's so much of what we do, whether it's the tabletop or video game. It's reliant on a supportive community, because if the players don't want to play it, you don't have a successful game on your hands. So I think you almost, it behooves you to sort of welcome input from players in order to give the community some sort of life to carry on. Yeah.
And actually, I was just going to say the TTRPG industry has been fueled by fans who've become creators over the years.
That's certainly the case. I'll drop two extra comments on that. One, on the video game side, you've also got the modding communities, which are definitely worth consideration, if nothing else, in this particular aspect, because there's often a bit of tension that slides between some modding communities and the studios that own the IPs, particularly if they themselves are intending on upgrading their games, as has recently happened with, say, games like Grand Theft Auto, with their re-releases, where they attacked with legal hammers the modding community, saying you must now take everything down because we're intending on releasing our own versions. And that can bring a lot of tension in the communities. But that aside, I think on the tabletop side, involving the fans is not just a part of the process. In many respects, it is the process, because the worlds that you present to the players are the worlds that they will be playing, and it will become their world. It won't be yours anymore. Quite unlike the computer role-playing game, where they are always going to be presented with a world that is very much crafted for them and presented to them in a particular fashion, whatever way that may be. When it comes to the tabletop side, it will always be through the mouthpiece of the GM, who will always take on the aspects that they think are important. And because of that, it is by its very nature a fan-created piece that is then presented to everybody else when they do their own interactive theater, so to speak, for the role-playing game at hand.
Quite so, but even in video games, what's presented to the players is really a potential experience, and it doesn't complete until the players do their parts, and there's no final experience until the players make their choices, do what they're going to do, decide for themselves what parts of your game are important and what parts of your game are unimportant, and their decisions then create the experience, in real time. The experience is ephemeral, but it's no less real for all of that. It's no less real for being momentary, because it's like music. It's happening in the moment, and it can be just as emotionally moving as music can be, even though it's not set in stone like the words on the page in a novel.
I'll add to that and say I completely agree. And in some respects, you can almost take the game designers and the whole teams behind the computer role-playing games as the GM, and the players have an extra step when you're dealing with a role-playing game at the tabletop, where they have almost an extra GM that sits between them, the creators, the GM, and then the players. And that extra filter creates a completely different environment while simultaneously being very similar.
I've been emotionally moved in Resident Evil many times, yes.
Positively or negatively?
Yes.
Well, yeah, that's the point. Yeah. I could only play it 20 minutes at a time because it was so traumatic. But I did to myself because I would play it in the dark with the lights off. It's the theater that you're choosing to experience.
So here's one from Alexandre, which is more about in the background. What do you feel is the best way of tracking a shared world's design decisions, and how would you introduce all of that to a new writer entering the project? And then there's another question which is similar. Have you used, or would you recommend online resources such as World Anvil when designing your world?
So when you're designing a world up from scratch that nobody's ever seen before, and you get everybody in the same brain space about what world you're building, it's really important to have region and society and character Bibles about these things, so that people have points of reference, at least for the initial game that you're building, so that you're all building the same game. Now, that rapidly, it's impossible to keep those up to date. Because the game mutates and evolves as it's being built, and that's just the way it goes. And so, eventually your character Bibles turn into an internal wiki where you try to keep stuff up to date. But here's the cool part: once you publish something and it goes out into the wild, players grasp onto it, and they go nuts for the details, and so thereafter, you will find that your best resource is usually fan-based wikis, because they have got the masses of troops and time to get all this stuff tracked and in a place that can be searched and cross-referenced, and sometimes there's mistakes, and so that's better than not having it at all. Usually it's spot on. So, any world that has got any kind of publication history, the internet is going to know more about it than you're going to be able to keep in your head. So knowing what you need to keep in your head is your intentions and your tone, because the facts are commonplace and commonly held, and then you can find them at need. So that's the best way of tracking a shared world's design decisions. Have somebody else do it. All your players, they're really happy to do it for you.
That's fascinating. Although, actually, yesterday on Discord, we were talking about something in Wifrip /Warhammer, and I did go to a fan-created wiki to find a quotation that would help us decide one way or another. So yeah, I have used fan-based wikis an awful lot. Both in
I used to do all the time with Blizzard. Yeah, I used to do with trying to keep track of World of Warcraft lore when you're working on a new character or a new location, and you kind of feel the need. Oh, I better make sure I fully swatted up on the background before I dive too far into this. And you would think that there would be that resource would be internal, and there are dedicated lore masters that certainly have an awful lot of information in it, but sometimes it's easy to pop onto a forum, ask a question, or browse some wiki and pick up the information that you need from there. Yeah.
Agreed. You'd think that there was somebody who was employed to look after all of the lore at larger companies. Hardly ever encountered that in my life. When, just to use a single example, when it came to, say, Warhammer, there was no consistent internal lore that I had to draw from. I had no document I could refer to and say, this is the truth. Indeed, the online resources, as suggested by Lawrence, were by far the most recognized sources that you could find, and they were proliferated full of fan material, a material that had been created by fans and had been, to a degree and almost by osmosis, picked up because it hadn't been properly cited for its source in some places, which made it a particularly difficult resource to draw from as someone who was writing something that was official, because you don't want to use material that someone else has spent a lot of time on and will claim is theirs, because that can just cause arguments. So when I was running Warhammer, for example, I pretty much had to fulfill that role. Fortunately, I had read every book and I'd done every game, so it wasn't a role that I was ill-suited for, but it was nevertheless a tough one, because you then have to also pass it through Games Workshop's filters, and the people that might be on their side might not know their own lore either. They may never have read all the sources. So you then have to cite all your sources for them, as well as the writers that you're working with. It's an interesting juggling act to perform, sitting in the middle of all that. But in terms of tracking it, I could not agree more. There are resources out there that do the jobs generally far better than any individual could anyway. But the last one, for bringing in a new writer, I've found that in almost every case, some form of World Bible or some form of dedicated document for introducing all of the core concepts. And a lot of the time for new worlds, it's down to tone, the primary themes, what is important to convey to the readers, to the consumers of the material. They are often far more important than the individual lore details, because they can all be massaged with relative ease. But if you get the tone wrong, then you're having to rework the piece entirely. A lot of projects I've walked into have had these, and I have always found them remarkably useful.
Yes, absolutely. How would I introduce a new writer? Always start with the tone, because you know, they're going to pick up the facts by osmosis, but they're going to get the look and feel by you going through it with them, and then pair them up with somebody else who's more experienced and have them just bolt them to the hip of a more experienced person working on the same area, and have them work together for a couple of months, and then you turn them loose on areas of their own, or you find out that they are not going to get it about your particular world. So that's that works most efficiently, I think.
I agree. I'll just add a small thing. That's pretty much the job that I was given through the second edition of Warhammer. I was the IP guy, as Lindsay mentioned earlier. Whenever a new project came up with a new writer that they weren't sure of, it typically was me co-authoring that book with them to ensure that all of the core detail was there while they were dealing with often the greater points of tone, general content. And I came in and made all this is now Warhammer adjustments to ensure that it actually nailed the setting as much as it nailed the overall tone for the documents. But yes, it's a very strong way of ensuring that the content that is created at the end works best for all, and also trains up the other people in what's required for that individual setting. Pairing people up.
So have you ever been working on a collaborative design when someone has thrown a random suggestion into the mix and everyone involved has said, we need this in our world right now? If so, how did that turn out?
That usually turns out one of two ways. The first way is that it genuinely is a really great idea, and then it's like obvious in hindsight. We should have had this idea in here. How did we not think of this before? This ties things together in a way that is clear, obvious, and relevant. Sold, adopted, done. The other way it works out is badly, because it's an in-joke, where somebody comes up with something that is hilarious to everybody who's working on the project and doesn't mean jack shit to the players. And so including it is wrong. It's bad, it's dumb, don't do that. Kill your darlings in that regard. Do not do in jokes, but stuff that is that everybody instantly realizes is apropos. Don't make room for it, and do so right away. Don't be too attached to the way things were before. When you've got a great new idea that is going to make things work out better, make room for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's always the assumption that when you're putting something together, writing something early on, that it's going to get better as more people work on it, and better ideas will come in, and it will eventually end up being crafted to this beautiful thing that everybody sort of aspires to make, and just always be ready for that. Always be ready to have cool new things pop in. I mean, for me, I occasionally I know when something goes to press, as it were, when something is sort of finished and locked, I always get a little bit wistful, thinking, oh, did we get all the great ideas in there? Is there one just waiting around the corner that now we're going to struggle to get in now because we've released it? So the build up to that point is, I always find really exciting, because anything can still go, and then once it's out there, then you've got to go, okay, well, maybe that great idea that I know is coming next week, we can save it for the next thing.
I'll add a slightly different angle. One thing that I would suggest, just in general, particularly if you're part of a collaborative team, is not to get too precious, because these sort of things happen. Someone comes up with a marvelous idea, but it might run all over one of your ideas, and it might be an idea that you loved, and their idea might be better. And that can sometimes be a bitter pill to swallow, particularly if you've not been involved with collaborative projects very much, and you're very, very keen to be as positive as possible to the general contribution. You want to feel like you're making an impact. And if you feel that your impact is being in some way dismissed because of other people's ideas, that can get right to your heart, and that can actually hurt, and it can send you off to have a little pace around the room while you try to decide, is this right? And the answer is almost certainly yes, because you're making a better product. You were part of that step-by-step process that brought that idea to the fore. That idea may never have occurred if you hadn't come up with your previous ideas. Don't be precious. Take a look at it as the bigger project, and always try to remember the bigger picture, because you are hopefully building something that engages people in a way that is really worthwhile and will have an emotive difference on them. You hope so.
Yeah. Yes, and it's usually your really enthusiastic new designers who have not worked on a title before, who cling most zealously to their ideas, because they haven't yet gotten enough experience under their belts to realize that they've got more ideas. There's plenty of ideas. If this particular idea doesn't get used, it's cool. You, pal, you're going to have more ideas. It's not a problem. Don't worry about an individual idea. You wouldn't have gotten this job if you weren't a fountain of ideas. So, let's just keep at it. It'll be fine.
It was often one of the first things that I'd have to say to some writers when they're brought on a project, was to ensure that they understood that no matter how brilliant their ideas may be, they may not be the ideas that hit the final project outcome, whatever that project might be, because of a whole host of different reasons, many of which will be beyond that writer's control, or possibly my control if I'm the person making the decisions. And that's just something that you have to accept as being part of a collaborative project. And ensuring that that's cleanly communicated at the beginning and reinforced as you go along can make the inevitable outcome, which is the super enthusiastic idea that's crushed outcome that comes to pass, much easier to accept for all parties, because it does happen. Now, hopefully it doesn't. In a perfect world, everything runs beautifully smoothly, but it's rarely a perfect world.
Or you may have moved on. I remember pitching to you my idea for the Great Hospice article and how I wanted to tie that in with rules in WFRIP for mental conditions. And then, of course, by the time the article was written and has come out, we'd both moved on from the project. So someone else took that. I haven't read it yet, but has probably completely changed it, because I was coming at it from a particular background of psychology and an interest in psychological history that someone else just would never have. So, worlds
absolutely.
that's one of the weirdest things about working on shared worlds, I think, is that they keep on going once you've moved on.
After you've gone. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good one. Seeing
Yeah.
other people take your ideas, there's nothing like seeing characters that you built one way be used in a completely different way by other writers, and you're like, wow, I didn't see that coming. Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, is that something that you feel attached to, Mark? It's happened to you that you've moved on and had to look back.
I get a warm glow every time I see Felix of Gothic and Felix in his stripy pants. Because the first time I was Gothic, the Troll Slayer had existed, but I think when Bill King paired him up with Felix, I was the first person to draw him, and I just randomly drew him in blue, stripy pants.
Yeah.
And every painting for decades since, Felix has had stripy pants.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that Felix got his stripy pants from you.
They could have changed his pants anytime they like, but not always in the stripy pants.
Iconic.
I feel an era. I feel if I ever see him without the stripy pants, a new era will have begun. There'll be spotty pants.
Yeah, spotty. Oh no, you couldn't have polka dots on Felix's pants. That would be awful. Anyway, we are almost at the end of our hour, so almost time to wrap up. Look forward to what we're doing next week. So Andy,
I gotta get something.
week.
I forgot.
Oh, okay. This is exciting.
Exciting.
So Andy, in the week you have got your cartography.
Oh, yes, I do. I've got the critical cartography where I'm going to be taking everybody that's in our stream step by step through the process of building a final area map. And I'm going to show you a very simple set of tools that you can use to build what appears to be a super professional, awesome map by the end of it.
And that's for Brazen Rooks.
That's for the Brazen Rooks and above, and that's going to be a lot of fun, I think.
I'm looking forward to that one because I could do with a whole bunch of those useful tools in making quick maps because I have no clue what I'm doing when it comes to map making.
That'll be my job.
And next Saturday, we've got an old friend of the two Andys and mine, Steve Ironside, coming on to talk about clubs competitions.
Yeah, it's completely different to this one.
Running those for many, many years now. Lawrence, over to you. What do you have to show us?
Okay, so as you can see from up on my screen where it says Lawrence Schick and then in parentheses Ellsworth, I live a double life. Lawrence Schick, I'm a game designer and a writer. And then as Lawrence Ellsworth, I work in historical fiction. And my current big project is that I am translating and creating new versions of all of Alexandre Dumas' Musketeer novels. So,
wow.
Whoops. So we're up to 5 volumes now.
Oh, gosh.
Volume 5, Between Two Kings, just came out last summer. There's 4 more volumes to come in some form or other. Accept no substitutes. If you're going to read The Three Musketeers or any of its sequels, you want the Lawrence Ellsworth translations. Get those suckers. They're really good.
We will share links on the Discord community and in Andy's follow-up Patreon blog. We can do that. And we'll add it to the one that Graham's done already so people can see those. Do you know, that's really interesting because although Three Musketeers, and D'Artagnan and the Muskehounds were a formative part of my childhood, I don't think I've ever actually read a translation of the original book. So quite timely. She'll be looking into it.
Yeah. They're a mere 350,000 words each. So, that's a good weekend. Look
or for me, an afternoon because
Lindsay reads so
devour books.
Yeah, I wish I could read like you do.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lawrence, for joining you. It's been a real pleasure to meet you. So I used D'Artagnan music in my last Wifrit campaign. Muskehounds, Juliet. Oh, I love the Musketeers. Anyway,
let's not get off on this one.
Graham Davis sends his apologies, being stuck in the far wilds of the north.
Finland.
And we will say thank you to Lawrence, thanks to Andy and Mark, the other Rooks, and we will see you all next time. Thank you to our patrons. Stick around for the credits, and we'll see you soon.
Keep elaborating.